This is Noreen at the Healthy Peaceful Podcast. Hello, my friends. My guest today is Amadea Morningstar, who makes her home in Sante Fe, New Mexico. Her business name is Ayurveda Polarity Therapy and Yoga Institute. Amadea is trained in Western nutrition, and she's been teaching food and healing for over 45 years. She started studying Ayurveda over 39 years ago with Dr. Vasant Lad, and she incorporates Ayurveda into her teaching and writing. She dedicates a significant portion of her work to the practice of polarity therapy, a hands-on healing system designed to assist the body in regaining its natural state of balance. Amadea is the author of several books, the most well-known being Ayurvedic Cooking, followed by Ayurvedic Cooking for Westerners. Her most recent book related to food and healing is titled Easy Healing Drinks from the Wisdom of Ayurveda, Delicious and Nourishing Recipes for All Seasons. A prolific writer, Amadea's blog has been voted at the top 30 in the Ayurveda category. There she marries a variety of topics with Ayurveda, including recipes and food, politics, women's health, racial inclusion and diversity, sustainability, and living by yogic and Buddhist principles. Wow, that's quite a commitment to a healing career. Welcome, Amadea, to the Healthy Peaceful Podcast.
Noreen, I am so glad to be here. And I just am inspired by the values that you embody with healthy and peaceful. And I'm particularly glad to be here at this moment on the planet, supporting a healthy, peaceful way of living.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I know that we're going to cover certain things today, and then we'll riff as well. But I know you have an upcoming course titled Dynamics of Ayurvedic Nutrition, Adapting Recipes for Individual and Cultural Needs. In this workshop, you describe that the participants will learn how to adapt traditional and non-traditional recipes into healing Ayurvedic recipes. And you ask each person to bring 2 recipes they would like to play with. I'd like to start with the word dynamic. You use that word when describing Ayurvedic nourishment. Can you give me a context as to why you chose the word dynamic?
Definitely. I think about dynamics of Ayurvedic nutrition as being related to energetics as well as our direct experience. And one of the exciting things about Ayurveda in general is that we're nature-based, and it's an invitation to ground back into our lives. And this morning I would just one of the examples I would use would be the senses. We bring the senses Ayurveda invites us to bring the senses to any experience. And each of the senses relates to one of the 5 elements. So we've got, taste, smell, touch, sight. And this morning is, and sound. And each of these can be engaged when we're working with nourishment. So that's one way that we're working with dynamism. And sadly, this morning, the first thing I noticed with my senses as I was waking up was the smell of smoke, because here in northern New Mexico, we've got big fires going.
Oh, I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah, huge. In fact, only 25 miles from where I woke up in the forest, people have been evacuated. Okay. And so I'm also very aware of that our senses keep us safe. And our senses also connect us with the world, sometimes in poignant ways. So I'm very aware of climate change in my immediate area.
Sure. Well, I like what you said about certainly with food senses. The senses are very important because you can't get away from food being a sensory experience.
Yeah.
Okay. We can have a whole episode about the emotional aspects of eating as well. But food energetics, tell me what you mean by that.
Yes, so at the foundation of Ayurveda, we've got the gunas, the 20 attributes, the pairs of qualities. And those things think hot, cold, heavy, light.
And these are pairs of opposites, essentially.
Pairs of opposites. And in Ayurveda, we use those opposites to heal. So if someone is running oily, we'll invite the opposite guna of dry. If someone is feeling heavy, we would introduce more light. And one of the things energetically that sometimes is, it takes a little bit to understand is that the gunas, for example, the guna of hot and cold applies to both like warm foods and cold foods, but it also moves beyond temperature to work with the energetics. So certain foods, even though they might be served as a hot dish, would be considered cooling because they inhibit digestive fire, whereas other foods might do the opposite. And so when we're working with the energetics of Ayurveda, we're working with both our obvious common sense, what we can sense with our senses and taste in our mouth. And yet we're also working with more subtle energetics of how the food nourishes us in the long run. So that's where we look at the tastes, and the 6 tastes have both the taste in the mouth, but then the effect on the belly, and then the long-term effect on metabolism. And so that would also be part of the dynamics, part of the energetics.
Yeah, I think that's a really beautiful part of Ayurveda. We're not, we have the 6 tastes, which are sweet, sour, salty, bitter, pungent, astringent. And my understanding is that you want to utilize those 6 tastes to try to create a balanced meal. I mean, you're not going to, and after a while, I assume your intuitive wisdom starts coming into place as to, what's, the astringent element and all of that. But Ayurveda also has these looking at food energetics beyond the 6 tastes, in terms of, how they're going to impact digestion, whether it's going to be heating or cooling, and really, like you said, how it's going to be metabolized by the body. So that's really beautiful. Yeah,
and that's where, from an Ayurvedic perspective, we're talking about rasa, virya, vipak. Rasa being the taste, virya being the energetic effect on the digestive system, and vipak being, the long-term effect.
Okay. Give me an example of, just a quick example of when a client comes in, and let's say they're running, they're very pitta, they're very hot, they're very driven, they like spicy foods, they have heartburn, all the typical, kind of what we think of as typical pitta characteristics. Give me an example of a food and the rasa, virya, vipak, that I know that we're looking at food and the synergy of food. It's not typically one food, but give me an example of something that would be very good for somebody who's really suffering from a pitta imbalance.
Well, not surprisingly, I would first think about basmati rice.
Okay.
So basmati rice is considered sweet. Mm-hmm. Got a cooling vipak, and it's got a sweet after effect. So it would be calming for pitta, it would be calming for vata, and it would also, because it's relatively light, can be tolerated by kapha. And I think of a client I had last week who was in this situation, and where his pitta was running very high. Mm-hmm. And he adored nightshades. He was having lots of chilies and tomatoes. And what we negotiated toward was, given his particular health needs, if we could reduce the nightshades but leave in cumin, coriander, cilantro, onions, and garlic. So not too much garlic, but that was like, because for him to give up chilies was a big deal.
Sure. So, and you didn't want to leave them spiceless,
No, exactly. And of course, fortunately, he did like cilantro, and he was up on, so what he would do is steam up veggies, with different, with these different spices and the onions and the garlic. Awesome. But to drag himself away from serranos, or a jalapeno.
Yeah, he couldn't just go from serranos to no serranos, no onion, no garlic.
Yeah, so we stepped it down.
Yeah. That's a great approach with clients, a graduated approach.
And also hanging out more with zucchini and less with tomato.
Right, just looking at vegetables that are going to be a little more balancing for him. Awesome. Yeah. We have today, you and I are going to talk about a couple of recipes that are kind of traditional recipes and cultural. But before we do that, and you're going to tell me how, if somebody is working with this recipe, how to make this Ayurvedic. But before we actually do that, I'd like to ask you what makes a food or a meal Ayurvedic. We've already kind of covered that with the 6 tastes and growing awareness of the rasa, the energetic effects. Is there anything else that you think is important?
The first thing that comes up is a respect for nature and the elements, mm-hmm. and how food is prepared. Right. If food can be prepared with love, loving kindness, sure. That's definitely going to be influencing the impact of the meal. In terms of sattva, rajas, and tamas.
Actually, let me actually ask a question about that. You hear a lot about, in the hands of a chef. And I can often taste, I know who prepared, I've lived in different community settings, and I often know who prepared the meal.
Yeah.
But do you really think there's something to that if the chef is balanced, if the chef is preparing it with respect and love, that actually enhances the digestibility and the pleasure element of the diner?
For sure. And from an Ayurvedic perspective, we've got sattva, rajas, and tamas, and the sattva being, sweet, neutral, and compassionate. And so that would be that kind of quality. I also think about the movie like Water for Chocolate. I don't know if you saw that, but just the chef in there, she was just, as she was making the meal for the wedding, she was just weeping into the cake batter.
Or how about Babette's Feast?
Yeah, just these influences,
Right.
So I would say, yeah, for sure. The other thing is that a meal needs to be digestible from an Ayurvedic perspective. And so, for example, we use a fair amount of mung beans and rice. And mm-hmm. yet, if someone can't digest beans, then that wouldn't be considered an optimal meal for them. Like I have friends who adore Ayurveda and yet can't handle khichdi. And so for that person, I would recommend something else rather than trying to lure her toward something that is considered perfect from an Ayurvedic perspective, but in terms of her direct experience is not digestible. So it has to be digested by our system and also feel satisfying.
That's a great point, because you'll study Ayurveda and all the texts will say, well, khichdi is the most mung beans are the easiest thing to digest, but it's really the client's direct experience that matters.
Yeah.
And you don't want to, just because they don't adopt a staple Ayurvedic, what's considered a staple Ayurvedic food, you don't want to leave them with the impression that Ayurveda isn't for them.
Exactly.
Or there aren't ways that they can't improve their food or their life experience with Ayurveda.
Definitely. And also I think about, preparation too, and that some people are able to tolerate beans if they've been, soaked overnight or
sure.
If they're fresher beans. I was amazed years ago, I was growing beans in my garden, and there was a particular kind of black bean that usually would take a couple of hours to cook, but fresh out of the garden, it was a dish, it was
like cooking fresh pasta.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And that's another big part of Ayurveda is we'll talk about freshness. And freshness is sometimes freshness and raw are confused. From our perspective, fresh foods are those that not only have been prepared with love, but also they could be straight from the garden, straight from the produce section, but they're not so processed, canned, frozen. So when possible, we're supporting fresh foods.
Right. Yeah. So essentially,
both cooked and raw.
Right. So you really want, and that's really getting into the prana, the life force, and the vitality in the food.
Exactly.
you want to support in the digestion.
Yeah.
And I think also that also applies to leftovers, which many people seem very puzzled about that. And Americans are, they're just wedded to leftovers and creative uses of leftovers. Are there any ways that people can use leftovers in Ayurveda if they, how people want to prepare their food on Sunday and then eat it every day, same thing every day of the week?
Yeah. Well,
I think the Instant Pot should cure anyone of having to do that. But I know there's people who still like to do that.
Yeah, no, I hear you. And again, it has to do with individual needs. So with many of my clients, if I can lure them toward making something fresh for dinner that they'll take the next day for lunch, so that produces stress for them. And for Ayurveda came from a time when there were chefs, just 24/7. And that's not our reality.
And there wasn't any refrigeration.
No.
Yeah.
So we'll negotiate, because sometimes there are folks that do, like, okay, Sunday afternoon, I'm going to make my food, for the week. I try to encourage people to be as fresh as possible. And yet also, if someone has home cooked food, as opposed to, say, going to Burger King, there's definitely going to be a value, a higher value in the fresh home food. I do have to admit that one time a client came to me and said, I'm so excited. I just made khichdi for a month and I have 30 days of frozen khichdi. And I was trying to lure her toward contributing it to the compost.
You didn't want to burst her bubble, but it wasn't quite,
No. And it's also a reason why Renee Lynn and I wrote Easy Healing Drinks, because a lot of those recipes are 5 to 15 minutes. Some of them are whole meals. And so they're easy, simple, Ayurvedically based foods that don't take, an hour and a half to make.
That's great. That's absolutely awesome. You indicate when you're working with a client that you use a food history and specific interview techniques to elicit key foods that you will then utilize to create Ayurvedic recipes for the client. Can you share an example of some of the questions that you consider to be important?
Well,
to elicit, to get them to tell you what these key foods are for them.
But so the first thing, anytime someone is coming to see me, I ask them to do a 3-day food recall and to bring it with them. Okay. And so right off the bat, one of the first things I just see is whether people are getting a chance to have regular meals. Because that's such a grounding part of Ayurveda and also part of surviving life in the 21st century. So one thing would be just timing and whether the person is getting enough meals, whether they're eating on the run. Lots of times I would just ask, what are your favorite foods and where do you shop? Because if I know where they're shopping, then I can recommend, different kinds of foods, or like, have you thought about this? Oftentimes I'll start a question with, have you thought about, and that way they can, it's not a right or wrong sort of thing. It's like, have you considered? And so that's one way that I'll elicit information. I'll also, as I'm making up recommendations, say, are there foods you just absolutely just abhor? Is there something you don't want on this piece of paper that I'm going to send you, with you with these recommendations, So a lot of it is that.
So and then you get a sense of their preferences, where they shop. Okay.
Yeah.
And whether they're having regular meal times.
Yeah. And where they won't go, like, forget it, like, I don't care what you say about okra and how fine it is for me. I'm not going to have it.
Yeah. You don't want to be starting at that point. That's for sure.
Yeah. So. And as part of an assessment I'm looking at pulse, tongue, and nails. And so I'll be combining, a constitutional assessment with what I'm seeing from their food recall.
Of course. And by that, you mean essentially their mind body type and what might be appropriate for them.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah, let's see. You told us about the gunas and the six tastes, so that's great. Oh, this is good. Do you consider a healthy meal different than a nourishing meal?
Oh, that's a great one.
Because we're always, there's so much information about healthy food and healthy eating, but it's not necessarily nourishing.
That's that's a really beautiful question, Noreen. And
thank you.
I'd say that nourishing has a friendlier connotation.
Mm-hmm.
We'll think about the five koshas in Ayurveda, which is like the physical effect of a meal, the energetic effect, the emotional effect, how our mind receives it, and spiritually, how our whole system receives it.
Yeah.
And so in that way, nourishment and nourishing evokes more. Healthy, like when a client says, I want to head toward healthier values, I want to head toward a healthier lifestyle.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like that kind of fleshes out healthy in a really positive way.
Sure.
There's other times where someone might come in and say, my partner says I should have this healthy food. And you can see that they're just kind of shutting down. So from an energetic point of view, there's times where healthy feels really positive and opening, and
Sure.
other times where it can feel constricting or pressuring. So in that way, I would vote. It would depend on what the words mean for the person I'm working with.
Of course. Yeah. I think when I think about nourishment, I get up from the table and everything's a smile.
Yeah.
Everything's a smile.
Yeah.
So there's certainly more to it than that, but I'm glad that you appreciated that question as well. Awesome. So.
Yeah. And that's really a great answer. I mean, a nourishing meal is one that you just radiate happiness, like just there's a smile there. Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely. Now, in this workshop, you're going to work with the participants, and you're going to play with a recipe. Tell me what you mean by that.
Well, in order to write the Ayurvedic cookbook and also Ayurvedic Cooking for Westerners,
Mm-hmm.
For a North American audience, I drew from a lot of traditional cookbooks like The Joy of Cooking.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I also, Mataji Desai was my partner in writing the Ayurvedic cookbook, and we had all sorts of great Gujarati recipes, from the west of India. And yet we also filled it out with some adapted Western recipes. And so, I'd love to talk about, like that process of how one plays.
We're going to get into that specifically with the recipe, but I didn't know if you wanted to just generally look at that now, but we can, why don't we wait until the actual recipes? But
I think part of play evokes openness.
Oh, yeah.
So it's we bring openness and lack of judgment. So it's not like we're looking at right, wrong. It's more like, oh, isn't this interesting? And how could we shift this from the point of view of the gunas and the tastes to something that will fit this person or this household or the season?
Yeah, that's really great.
I don't want to get too serious.
Yeah, well, it's supposed to be fun.
Yeah.
It has the word. It is the word play. So
yeah.
And I'm sure that if you have 6 participants, everybody's going to come up with something very different.
Yeah.
And they could all be Ayurvedic.
Exactly. So
it just has to. It's their own creativity at work.
Exactly. And I flash on the Iroquois, because the Iroquois talk about there's at least 6 different responses to any challenge. And similarly, like when you say if there were 6 people coming to a workshop, they would come up with 6 different ways to adapt this recipe, and they would all be great.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see. Are there a set of key principles that can be used every time you approach a recipe that you would like to adapt to an Ayurvedic recipe?
So looking at the gunas,
right.
So we go through yes, no, in terms of, is it light? Is it heavy? Is it cold? Is it hot? Looking at the tastes, looking at its sustainability and how appropriate it is for a particular situation. We're in a place on the planet right now where I feel like we need to take the lead as much as possible in our own lives, because we're really, well, people are talking about 30-year plans. Many times the kinds of responses we need to make to climate change or sustainability are in the next few years, and not decades away. And so there's also ways that I'll be inviting people to think about the sustainability of a recipe, and even just whether or not we use a plastic bag when we go to the produce section, or, like this Earth Day, my local grocery sold cool cotton bags that, for cheap, that we could be using instead of the plastic bags. And that would be,
I look at the word sustainability to be certainly the sustainability of the environment and the planet, especially where we are right now. But also it may not be sustainable for someone's lifestyle.
Exactly.
Or for their preferences, or for their budget.
Yes. Yeah. And years and years.
Like if you're gonna have cardamom pods and that's just not in, maybe it's not, except unless they're going online, they may not be able to get cardamom pods. And also it may be too costly for them.
Absolutely, Noreen, because it's like cardamom has just soared in price in the last few years.
Yeah.
And so that's something that if we were to use it at all and the person was lucky enough to have access to it, we might use a whole lot less with a whole lot more respect than, a number of years ago. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, I know that you have prepared 2 recipes that you have played with, or that you're going to play with. And the first is mac and cheese. And I guess we can categorize mac and cheese as traditional American comfort food if we were to give it an ethnic. Perhaps it has something else. I didn't research it, but so tell me, how would you approach this dish from an Ayurvedic perspective?
Yeah. So we'd pull out the gunas. We'd look at our gunas worksheet. And first we'd ask ourselves, is this heavy or light? I can ask you, is mac and cheese?
Well, I believe it's heavy.
You better believe it. And then the next thing we look at is it sharp or dull? So manda or tikshna. And as a comfort food,
I'm going to say dull.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
That's
not necessarily a bad thing, dull.
No, dull can be soothing. Dull can be like lack of stimulation at a time when we've been overstimulated. And it, again, so manda is the comfort of something familiar and not too flashy, whereas tikshna, sharp, would be like very spicy. Now, I know some of the joy of cooking mac and cheeses did have a fair amount of, they'd put, red pepper in them or
sometimes they do put a little bit of spice in them, but
yeah. But in general,
probably not in the joy of cooking recipe.
Oh, you'd be surprised. It's gotten water,
Okay.
Yeah. So then we look at hot or cold.
So we look at the gunas. We look at overall whether it's in terms of the impact. Manda would be the kind of the dull. The impact on the digestion. It's going to be slow and dull and okay.
You got it. And then we look at things like oily or dry. It's obviously, it's gonna, there's a good amount of butter and cheese in mac and cheese. It's not a dry food, it's an oily food.
So it would be, those are gunas, opposites, oily, unctuous, and dry. And so it would be oily or unctuous, rich.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, rich is a great way to describe it.
Okay.
And then we look at hot and cold. And this is where the Ayurvedic energetics and dynamics come in, and that it's obviously, stovetop mac and cheese is a hot dish. And yet
the temperature is hot.
The temperature is hot.
Served warm.
And yet wheat pasta is considered cool.
Okay.
Okay.
So the wheat would be in terms of it's going to cool the body.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
And then cheeses in general tend to be hot and sweet. But you can, when you think about the taste of different cheeses in your mouth, depending on what cheese you're going to choose, some might be a little sour, like, or salty, like
It could
feta.
be cheese could be very sharp.
Exactly.
But the energetic effect is it's heating to the body, generally, cheese.
Usually, though it's funny because there's certain cheeses that I tend to use more in mac and cheese, like Gouda or goat Gouda, that because it's been washed, it's a little bit cooler.
I see. Okay.
So depending on the cheese you pick, you also would be influenced whether or not it's going to be cold or hot.
How about if you used a fresh cheese like paneer? I mean, I know you're not going to use that probably in mac and cheese. Does that have a different?
You could though, I mean, depending on how wild your adaptation is, you could play with paneer. Yeah, and paneer has a lot the same energetics as ricotta, so it tends to be friendlier to all doshas.
All right, good.
It's still going to have some, cheese in general is going to have some heaviness. So we're going to, and pasta, clearly it's got some heaviness.
Okay.
And yeah.
Okay, cool. All right. So far we got, it's heavy. It's oily, unctuous. In terms of the virya, in terms of the energetic effect, it's the cheese. Wheat is cooling, cheese is heating.
So it's kind of neutral.
Yeah, so they can balance each other a bit there.
Yep.
Okay. So let's say you have a mac and cheese recipe from Fanny Farmer or Joy of Cooking. I don't even know if people use those cookbooks anymore, but let's assume. Are you going to make changes to that recipe?
Better believe it.
Okay.
So what's coming out is that, like, you can see that there's a certain heavy quality, especially. Right. We could dance through the rest, but you're getting the picture. Sure. And then what we do is look at the taste. And from the taste point of view, we've got, as you said, sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and astringent.
Right.
There's a certain sweetness inherent in both the pasta and the cheese. Okay.
Right. Okay.
So there's quite a bit of sweet, and sweet taste tends to be, again, heavy, moist, cool, oily, which is a lot like mac and cheese already.
Right. So it's really got that heavy, moist, cool. Okay.
You got it. And so there's a little, there's a little bit of sour. There's a little, but not much, really. So the strong thing about, mac and cheese is going to be that it's sweet. It's also, interestingly enough, pasta is considered a little astringent. So we've got this sweet astringent food. And so what we're looking to do is to balance it. And so, as you said earlier, the 6 tastes, it's nice if the 6 tastes are present in a meal. And so here we've got 2 of the 6 tastes, but we're really missing sour, bitter, and pungent. Okay. And so either we can increase those in the dish, or we can put them in dishes around the mac and cheese.
Right. And you can have condiments.
You better, yeah.
Another way to do it. And which way would you typically do it? Would you try to introduce for the bitter taste bitter greens on the side, or would you try to incorporate that into the mac and cheese dish itself?
So it depends on the household. So my particular household adores pasta salads, warm pasta salads. And so we'll cut out the cream sauce, we'll do the cheeses, we'll do the pasta, and then we'll have a whole lot of exciting vegetables in there. Right. Someone else would be appalled by that. Someone would be, give me my mac and cheese, I'm willing to have veggies on the side. So it depends on them. But clearly, in order to lighten up this meal, we'd want to invite a fair amount of veggies, whether that was bitter greens, as you said, could be, could even be a little pungent, could be arugula, mustard, parsley, basil, cilantro, any of those would be wonderful, in a pasta-ish, salad-ish kind of thing. Sure. Or you could serve, a salad, spring to fall, or asparagus or green bean dish on the side. But the dessert you're going to have is going to be something that's pretty light. So it could be
Right.
kind of wafer-like. Like I think about in Ayurvedic cooking for Westerners, I've got something called dream cookies, and they're just ground almonds, water, and maple syrup. They're very, very light and
Right. You're not going to have ice cream, in other words, or yeah.
Got it.
I love it. It's like having pizza and ice cream, mac and cheese and ice cream.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Awesome. Okay. So people really have some flexibility in terms of looking at the taste and, whether in terms of creating that balanced Ayurvedic meal, whether they want to incorporate into side dishes or in the main dish, there's a lot of flexibility there.
And then there's also, you think about portion size. So from the point of view of this is a dish that's going to be most soothing for Vata, and with the Gula, you could it also would be helpful for Pitta, and yet more likely for Kapha, you'd be serving it as a side dish rather than as an entree. And for Kapha, you'd give a whole lot more, say, steamed asparagus or simmered green beans. The other thing I'm like, not everybody.
That's a very good point. That it's not going to be mac and cheese is not going to be balancing for everyone. But even if it's not necessarily good for your constitution, if you're Kapha, which has a lot of the same qualities as mac and cheese, unctuous, heavy, the Kapha person, then maybe just a small amount and more vegetables. Or is there the option to not use cow's dairy, or to use
for sure
use something other than?
You could go for goat or sheep. And goat dairy tends to be more astringent than cow dairy, so it's going to be friendlier to Pitta and Kapha. Okay. The other thing I think about is spices. If people are up for herbs, like putting basil or herbs de Provence or oregano in the dish, some people will be appalled by that. Other people will be like, "Wow, this is exciting," and it stimulates digestive fire, Agni. So I
think basil would be beautiful in mac and cheese. I don't know if I've ever had it in it, but I'm sure it'd be delicious. Yeah.
We do it a lot.
And my understanding is basil is very good for the digestion as well.
Gorgeous. You can even use Tulsi basil. You can even grow fresh Tulsi basil and put it in your mac and cheese. Okay. The other thing to think about in terms of hot and cold and pasta is that you could use not only a different cheese, you could also use a different pasta. And so, for example, there's quinoa corn pastas that would be friendlier for Kapha. There's rice pastas that you boil up for 2 to 3 minutes, and then you let them sit for 15 to 16, which from a sustainability point of view, you're using a lot less fuel, and the rice is more tridoshic. Yeah. So there's different, depending on what pasta you use and what cheese you use, you can really make it friendly to almost any dosha, depending on the proportions.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. And I assume that the season's important too?
Yeah. So clearly this is a cold weather kind of dish.
Right. It's kind of a stick to your ribs type of.
Exactly.
You don't necessarily want to have it in the middle of July or something, although it is served at a lot of picnics.
Exactly. Or if you mutate it toward pasta salad, there's a lot of pasta salads and there you have high proportion of veggies, and it could be simmered veggies. You could throw your sliced zucchini or your greens in to cook with the pasta so that you don't have to, have 2 pots going, so there can be some really one pasta salads.
And with the pasta salad, you typically would eliminate the dairy. Would that be, or maybe a little Parmesan or something?
Parmesan, or maybe I'd put some chunks of Gouda in there.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Yeah. But not like a heavy cheese sauce for like milk and cheese not like that wouldn't be as palatable for a summertime pasta salad. Okay.
And you're bringing up a really good point, Noreen, in that our digestive fire is weakest in the summer. And so many foods are better taken from an Ayurvedic perspective when our digestive fire is strong, which is more fall, winter, spring. So we're heading toward the time where lighter foods are going to be easier to digest.
That's a really great point that, you want to tune into the strength of your digestion. Well, awesome. That sounds really exciting, the mac and cheese. But you have another recipe, and that recipe is chicken kahari. Did I pronounce it properly?
Actually, krahi.
Krahi.
Yeah.
Krahi.
So the second is,
I see, chicken krahi. And this is a Pakistani dish? A dish from
Afghanistan.
Afghanistan. And this, you're looking at a recipe from the Kitchen Without Borders cookbook. Well, if you could first, I'm not familiar with this recipe, so we're going to look at bringing this recipe into an Ayurvedic well-balanced recipe or meal. But could you first tell me how this recipe is prepared and the ingredients from a traditional perspective?
Yeah. So this is from Chef Bashir from Afghanistan, and it serves 4 to 6 as a main dish. And these are the Kitchen Without Borders has got fantastic refugee chefs who have.
Oh, beautiful! So it's essentially refugee recipes.
Exactly.
That's
and they're yummy. They're very yummy. And this particular recipe, so the ingredients: 3 tablespoons of vegetable oil, 1.5 cups of chopped yellow onion, 2 tablespoons of minced garlic, teaspoon of kosher salt, teaspoon of cumin seeds, teaspoon of ground coriander, teaspoon of ground turmeric, half a teaspoon garam masala, half a teaspoon freshly ground black pepper, very modest 1 pound of skinless, boneless chicken thighs, cut into 1-inch cubes, 4 teaspoons of freshly chopped fresh ginger, 4 plum tomatoes quartered, cooked basmati rice for serving, and cilantro sprigs for garnish. Optional.
Sounds delicious.
Doesn't it sound yummy?
Yeah, I like the ingredient list.
Yeah, and so basically you're sautéing these goodies up.
Right.
And the first thing you notice is that Afghani food has a lot in common with East Indian food.
Right. You have the was it cumin or coriander there?
Both. And turmeric and garam masala and ginger. So all of some of our key kind of iconic spices are also part of Afghan food.
Okay.
And so there's a lot that the first thing before I head into this, I would have to say that I've adapted lots of recipes in my life,
Sure.
And usually they go well. And yet I also think about one time many years ago, I was teaching a vegetarian cooking class where we were invited to cook for Aztec dancers. Our community was having a big bash, and the Aztec dancers, who were all made up of Hispanic and indigenous people from our area who had learned Aztec dancing,
they were native from New Mexico.
Yes, and Nuevo Mexicanos, and so we had the great honor of being able to feed them after they did their dance. And it was all, it was local veggie food, and they were very happy with, they were pleased with the cheese enchiladas and the rice and the beans. But here in New Mexico, we have something called pozole, which is like whole popped corn, which oftentimes usually is made with pork, and we made a veggie version that had a good amount of onions, and bay leaf and oregano, but no meat whatsoever.
And they felt it was missing something.
Oh, the dancers were appalled. Several of them were just like, what, So when anytime you adapt a recipe, it needs to be with respect and thinking about who's going to be eating this.
Yeah, that's true. And you do have to work harder when you're adapting for a native, or you're adapting a native recipe that you want to be attractive.
Yeah.
There's no doubt, because
Yeah. And I figured 4 out of 5 dishes was pretty good. And
I think that's a win.
Yeah, it's so just to make the big leap right away, if I were going to adapt this recipe for someone who was a vegetarian or a vegan, the first thing I would do, rather than a pounded chicken, would be probably chickpeas, garbanzos.
Okay, I was going to say tofu, but not why chickpeas and not tofu?
It's a not as far a leap from a Middle Eastern point of view.
That's true. Tofu isn't. Yeah, that's a very good point. Your part of this recipe development is you want to maintain the spirit of the recipe, and that takes some doing and thinking about culture. Yeah.
Yes. So if I were going to adapt it for a vegan lifestyle, that's probably where I would head.
Yeah.
Though there are some folks that would really digest tofu better, and so we might play with tofu.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, that could be an option, but if you want to really stay within the culture tradition, chickpeas would be the obvious choice.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so then I look at the onions. There's a cup and a half of onions. From the Ayurvedic perspective, I might try to shrink that down to a half a cup.
Okay. Yeah. Talk about onions from an Ayurvedic perspective, because I know we talked about it from the gentleman client of yours who didn't want to give up the serrano, but he's graduating to onions and garlic, and then maybe he'll minimize some of that too. Talk about onions, cooked onions specifically.
So cooked onions, especially roasted onions, are very calming for vata. Yes. And yet from the point of view of the mind, like if you've ever been in an ashram, onions and garlic are not served, in most ashram cuisine. Right. And the reason is that it can stir up the mind. Garlic in particular can make us a little fierier. Onion is considered fiery or either rajasic or tamasic. And so it's considered not as centering and calming.
It's challenging to meditate when the mind is stirred up. And
it can make the mind more restless.
Right. Okay.
And so we're looking to, at the same time, onion is sweet. If you're late to be making a meal and you start sauteing up onions and the guests walk in, lots of times they'll go, "Oh, it smells so good," even though there's just onions.
Cooked onions. Yeah. And that brings me to a point. There's really, when you're looking at people living in spiritual communities, ashrams, and the nature of sattva, which is that really purity, balanced, is that going to be different than looking at it from an Ayurvedic perspective? Those are really yogic terms, sattva. So I'm wondering, do we have to be, I know generally in Ayurveda, there's also not a lot of onions and garlic. And I don't know if that's, so how do you feel about that?
That's a very good question and a really good distinction. And I would go back to the mind-body connection that you mentioned earlier. Okay. And the fact that the purpose of Ayurveda is to have us be as healthy as possible to be able to wake up. Mm-hmm. And so from that perspective, I want to stir up the mind as little as possible.
Okay. All right.
And at the same time, I'd like to give the palate something appealing.
But you want to have some flavor going.
Exactly. And so I'm not going to cut out all the onion, but I might cut it by 2/3.
Okay. I like that as a compromise because, it's hard if a person's accustomed to cooking with onions to just nix the onions, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But, you can still have good flavor with less onions.
Yeah. And what I've also noticed is that some people, you can cut down the onion a lot if you use green onion because somehow it reads more. It's not terribly pungent, and yet partly it's beautiful. You'll see it. Right. So depending, sometimes that can be a comforting alternative.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah.
Would leeks be any less? They're a little milder than.
They're a little sweeter. Onion. Yeah. Or you might think of it here. The recommendation is yellow onion. You might go for sweet onions, which would even be, less pungent, more sweet.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's options.
Yeah. And similarly with the garlic, 2 tablespoons is a generous amount of garlic.
That's a lot of garlic. You have to garlic.
So I tone it. It depends on the person, but I might even get it down to, 1 clove,
Right.
Or some people might be willing to toss out the garlic.
Sure.
And if you hold on to the onion, so you do some negotiation.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe reduce the garlic, eliminate the garlic possibly. Any advantage of like having roasted garlic and putting that in there versus sauteed garlic? I don't know. Sometimes that seems milder, but it probably it probably still has the same effect on the body and the mind.
It's a little gentler, and you could turn it into a baked dish rather than a sauteed on the stove dish, and so that it would be a little more strengthening for vata, because ironically, while garlic has a bad rap in terms of the mind, it strengthens every single dhatu, every single one of our essential tissues.
Okay.
So especially roasted garlic.
Okay.
So,
all right. So there's reasons for including it, just maybe not too much.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome.
And if I were sticking with the chicken, it's already a really moderate amount. They're not talking about 3 or 4 pounds of chicken. They're talking about a pound.
Yeah.
From an Ayurvedic perspective, in the oily, unctuous, oily is soothing to vata. It aggravates pitta and kapha. So oilier, so chicken thighs would be oilier than chicken breast. Would be great for vata. You might choose different chicken if you wish to serve it more to pittas and kaphas, like chicken breast. Or turkey, you could even substitute turkey. Chicken is hot and sweet. Turkey has got a cooler action, so it's more soothing for pitta. And it's also a little bit more astringent, so it's more calming for pitta and kapha. So for some people, turkey would be an option, and then whether you chose turkey breast or thighs would depend on, the doshic balance.
Okay. All right. So the choice of the protein, even if you're going to stick with animal protein, would have an impact on how you're going to feel after eating the dish.
Yeah.
Right.
And also what feels comfortable to this person.
Right.
And it wildly, I'll even look at blood type. There's blood type diets. And
that I don't know. Is that still a big thing? I know it used to be, I believe, right? We're now caught up in the paleo keto wars.
Not paleo and plant-based, our dichotomies now. And yet I will sometimes, like in the blood type diet, a type B doesn't do well with chicken, where they do better with turkey. And I have sometimes seen people who flourished more with one choice compared to the other.
That's good to know. I don't think most people, most people are not, it's not on their radar that chicken is more heating to the body than turkey. I think they put them in the same camp.
Yeah.
So if you're a person who's prone to heat, then the turkey would be a better option, and you could still have the animal protein.
Yeah.
And it would be poultry. So that's a nice substitute.
Yeah. Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah. And then the other things would be just looking at, like, here we've got a half a teaspoon of freshly ground black pepper, which is going to ignite digestive fire. It's got a pungent taste. It's got a hot effect on the digestive system, and it has a pungent heating effect long term. So if someone was very wedded to that, I would leave it. But if they were open to trying pipali, East Indian long pepper, it has a lot of the same flavor, but it has a sweet VPOC, which means it's going to be a little cooler and a little friendlier on the gut. So
I just get into that a little bit, because well, first of all, the black pepper, would it have to be, sometimes people they buy pepper that's pre-ground, or maybe they have some they grind up themselves and they leave it in a container. Does it have to be freshly ground, or is it going to be different if it's freshly ground?
So I honor the recipe in terms of it would have the most prana and the most action.
Okay. And for some people,
in terms of sharp and dull, it would be more sharp.
Okay. And for some people, that pungent taste, and you said it's heating, which means it's going to enhance the digestive fire.
Yep.
For some people, that's good.
And for other people, like if you've got a lot of pitta, that would be a little tough.
Yeah, that'd be challenging. And tell me about, if you have a pungent, the rasa virya vipak, if you have a pungent vipak, what's the impact of the pungent vipak on the tissues, on the body?
It's going to be more drying.
Right.
And
It's going to be more, instead of building, it's going to be more detoxifying to the body, right?
Yeah,
so it might be good for kapha.
Yes.
So actually the fresh black pepper would probably be good for kapha.
Especially. Yeah.
Okay.
Whereas pipali with its sweet vipak would be friendlier to vata and pitta.
Okay. Okay. Vata pitta. That's great. That's
and then you look at the tomatoes.
Yeah, tomatoes are they have all sorts of things going on for people.
Yeah, so much. And one of the things Dr. Sunil Joshi years ago was evaluating my daughter's diet, and
he's in Albuquerque.
He passes through. He's in India.
Okay.
But Dr. Sunil Joshi wrote Ayurveda and Panchakarma.
Right.
He's a fine Panchakarma.
Yes. And he has a clinic in India.
He has a clinic in Nagpur. He also has a clinic in Albuquerque. And so at one point he took me aside about tomatoes and he said, if you're going to be serving your daughter tomatoes, and she was young at the time, please make sure that you have some cumin with it and some rose petals.
Oh.
And rose petals really calm the pitta aggravating effect of tomato. And
okay.
So I'll save our rose petals, our organic rose petals that will be coming in June. I'll save them and dry them and then put them in a glass jar, and I'll just crumble them up like spices in any that's got tomato in it.
So you don't grind them or anything. You just crumble them up right from do you dehydrate them or just let them air dry? Or
here in New Mexico, air dry.
It's so dry. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. You don't have to use a dehydrator. Okay.
But in Iowa,
do you notice
in Iowa,
that's true. You might need it. It's humid. We have Georgia-like summers in Iowa. A lot of humidity. So, so that's great. Tomato and rose, how does it taste together? I've never experienced that.
Literally sweet, so rose has got sweet and astringency in it.
Okay.
And so it just makes it a little more friendly,
Yeah.
And
That's cool. That's cool. So in this recipe, would you introduce the rose petals or would you do something else with the tomatoes?
I think that the rose petals would do great in this recipe, because they're simmering the whole dish together. You're cooking for at least 15 minutes and then another 10 minutes. So it would simmer in almost like if you think about the way rose petals are used in tea,
Right. Yeah. Awesome. Awesome. Well, I mean, this dish has been transformed to really,
and yet we really didn't need to do much because there were so many similarities between the food of Afghanistan and the food of India. So many of the same spices, so many of the same dynamics.
It was what you really did. You were really, it's more like you took the recipe and you finessed it. You just brought it a little closer, and I like the fact that you really the recipe still feels very much like a culturally appropriate recipe.
I also think like the basmati rice, the way an Afghan cook would make basmati rice is oftentimes to bake it, so in a shallow pan, and that would make it lighter and drier, which are qualities that would need to be, would be good in this to balance out the meal.
That's light and dry. So that's an accompaniment.
And then you'd have some wonderful kind of veggies on the side, whether that was, greens or zucchini or, different kinds of summer squashes would, be really resonant. And so you could just have a steamed, some kind of steamed veggie on the side that would be lovely that way. And I think about for dessert, I might even just serve dates,
Yeah, I think that the sweetness, kind of, because this has got a lot of the kind of heating. It's still a bit heating.
Yeah.
So that might be a nice, simple dessert.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it sounds delicious. Sounds really delicious. Is that a recipe that you're going to be working on in your upcoming workshop?
I think I would like to. Yeah.
That's a fun recipe. I like what you did with it. That was really awesome. So, well, this has been a great exercise, Amadea, in terms of really getting into the intricacies of two recipes, and really maintaining what those recipes are from, you can still recognize the recipe. It's not, but really introducing the balancing effect and the energetics of Ayurveda. So that's awesome.
And
well,
I think I might have said, Dr. Shamali Joshi, who's the partner of Dr. Sunil Joshi, once said, Shirak Samhita translates as those who walk everywhere. And her whole implication was Ayurveda can and ought to go everywhere. And the gunas are like our alphabet. They're our foundation. And so applying the gunas to any kind of cuisine, we can start to meet people in different places.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's really beautiful because, Ayurveda should be appropriate to every situation, every culture. It should permeate it all. And once we just acquaint ourselves with the qualities and how to interact with them.
Yeah, with respect. It's like with gladness and respect.
Right. And not being too rigid about it and having fun with it. And, it's not going to go perfectly the first time. So
doesn't have to. Yeah, we learn from our mistakes. Boy,
right. Right. And I like thinking about the gunas, the qualities, as the alphabet.
Yeah.
So when we learn the alphabet, we can start putting words together.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
And then recipes and then dinner.
You got it.
So that's a good thing. I know we're getting to the 1 hour mark, so I want to check in with you. I do want to touch base on your on the course that you've recently taught. And then I have some closing questions that I'd like to close with. Does that sound okay?
Sounds lovely.
All right, awesome. You recently taught a course. Well, thank you so much for that fun, because, I'm not sure if I told you, but I'm trained as a chef with the Natural Gourmet.
That's exciting. That's so exciting.
Yeah, so I could just keep going on and on about this, so I have to stop. But thank you. That was fun for me. Yeah, your recent course that you taught is titled Inclusion as Medicine and Working the 7 Chakras for Healing. And this course was 7 weekly sessions of 2 hours each. And you co-taught this course with your Ralph Steele, who is a meditation teacher. And I believe he's worked with people around trauma as well. You describe this course as a pathway to work together, to help us work together to heal racial, gender, and other differences, and to cultivate respect for such differences. I'd like you just to take a moment and tell me what prompted you to, I'm not going to say this is a shift in direction for you, but really to start teaching in this direction, because I can tell from your blog, you've been writing about this for a while. But tell me about the course, how it went, and what you hope to cultivate by embarking on teaching in this new area for you.
Ayurveda works with balance. And very much in my life, I'm looking at balance. And our country is out of balance. The planet, in terms of climate, is out of balance. And so I have this deep urge to balance. And there's such injustice and so much unfairness and just a lot of lack of connection when we're all connected. We're all very deeply connected. And Ralph and I, Ralph Steele is both a colleague and an old friend, and we both share Buddhism. We have different paths in Buddhism. And yet the Buddha asked, there's a wonderful book called Skill and Questions, which is by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, it directly explores how the Buddha taught with questions. And Buddhism was a bridge for us in our teaching. And so when we looked at each chakra, from the first chakra up to the 7th, each week we'd have a chakra and we'd create questions. We spent months and months thinking about the questions that would evoke a first chakra experience, in terms of survival and so the questions, we used questions that people would journal. about, on their own for 10 minutes. And then they would go into breakout rooms and discuss their responses.
Mhm.
And some of those questions addressed racism and issues of gender very strongly. Others didn't. And so depending on what people chose to answer, they either were really right on their edge or not so much. And it was exciting. The questions especially led people to think more deeply about their own lives. And then we did a specific bija mantra for each chakra that people would work with for 15 minutes every day. Throughout each week we would shift the bija. And so from the point of view of increased awareness, especially, I feel like we were successful. Yesterday, I was on the Naropa website.
Oh, of course. Yeah. In Colorado.
And they had I was drawn to their inclusivity section. And they said inclusivity is the practice of building just and equitable communities. And I that is definitely.
How simple is that, right? I mean, it's simple words.
Yeah. And so I feel like I'm still learning. I feel like I actually facilitated two other groups before Ralph and I did this one.
Okay.
So I've been working with the topic for the last couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like I still have a lot more to learn, and I may go inside for a while and meet with friends and see, okay, so what's the next step on this one?
Right.
But I feel really grateful for everyone who showed up for it, and we learned a bunch together. And that was it was very, very nourishing, really satisfying.
That's awesome. Well, I like the, I'm putting it together now, the 7 week, 7 chakras, and you had a bija mantra, the seed mantras. And I like your approach of teaching with questions. And, asking questions, because there's a lot to a question.
Yeah.
It's kind of like the question that I posed earlier about healthy or nourishing.
Yeah.
And, I think also the choice of words as well, when you're addressing topics that are so delicate, is really important.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And they need to be addressed. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for sharing your experience thus far. And I look forward to see how it continues to evolve for you.
Thanks for asking.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, we're next going to shift into concluding with some rapid fire questions, and you don't have to go any faster. Don't worry. Really just, short answer. And if it prompts a discussion, that's good too, but just some fun things to conclude. I'm going to start with Amadea. What do the words patience and persistence mean to you?
Wow. I just happened to open a Buddhist text this morning, and it said the roots of patience are being humble.
I love that. I love that. Radical humility.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that. Now that our lives have become more virtual, meaning our connections, yes, we're virtual right now, our connections are also more virtual. Can you give us one suggestion for thriving in this new virtual reality?
Take fasts from it.
Okay.
Take Wi-Fi fasts.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And also, I'm so aware that the Wi-Fi reality still has a great deal of energetic connection, and that can be both positive and challenging. So energy is transferred easily in virtual reality, and that should be dealt with respect. But yeah, lots of times with my clients, I'll ask them, are you willing to take a day off a week and just do no Wi-Fi at all? Or it might be that we negotiate, would you be willing to experiment with an hour? Because we're very connected to our devices,
Absolutely. Yes, that's beautiful. Thank you. What are the top 3 tips that you can offer that are simple yet profoundly healing?
Trust yourself,
Mm-hmm.
take time in nature,
Mm-hmm.
give yourself enough space.
Beautiful. Space. Yeah. 3 good words: trust, nature, and space. Essential. Thank you. What does the term wise woman mean to you?
In the Tibetan tradition, it's someone who has worked with meditation for a very long time. In our tradition, in the West, in North America, it could relate to a woman of any age who is in touch with her inherent wisdom.
Yeah, that's beautiful. So
there's a Canadian Indigenous author named Leanne Betasamosaki Simpson, who wrote a book, As We Have Always Done, about Indigenous ways and its applicability to the current moment. And she is definitely, she's probably in her early 50s, but she's definitely a wise woman.
That's awesome. And just repeat, As We Have Always Done is the name of the book. And it's
Leanne Simpson, and her indigenous name is Betasamosaki.
Okay.
Yeah.
I will include that in the show notes. As long as I have the rest of it, I'm sure I can find her. I won't ask you to spell it.
She's out there.
Yeah, that's great. That's awesome. Your favorite book on Ayurveda besides your own?
Right this moment, I'm thinking of Dr. Ladd's Textbook of Ayurveda series. How
many? Last time I looked, there were 3. Are there more?
I think there's still 3. There's 3 fat volumes, and I just still find them to be quite delectable.
Okay. So that's Dr. Vasant Ladd, and he has a series on Ayurveda, and it's 3 volumes set essentially.
It's called Textbook of Ayurveda.
Textbook of Ayurveda. That's easy to remember.
Yeah,
that's great. With his own diagrams, which is amazing. Yeah. You're obviously a big reader. As evidenced by your blog post with pictures of, you did a collage of many books. What are you currently reading?
I'm actually reading As We Have Always Done.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
As we've always done. Okay. All right.
That's
great.
There's the one coming up is there's a wonderful book about the mothers of Malcolm X. Oh, mercy. It's a wonderful, I'll probably be posting it around Mother's Day, but it's the mothers of 3 Black activists and how their lives impacted their son's work.
Okay.
So it's Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and Baldwin.
Wow, James Baldwin. Yeah, that's wow. Interesting book.
Yeah. So that's next on my list.
Yeah, that sounds like a great one. Your opinion on what it will take for Ayurveda to infiltrate our modern life, the way yoga has in the U.S.
I think we're on it. I think especially, I'm so excited that the National Ayurvedic Medical Association has got a diversity and inclusion committee that's
Yeah.
They're right on the cutting edge. And I feel like in opening to the current realities, we're just going to be, we're in a wonderful position to meet many more people as needed.
Okay. So your opinion is really that Ayurveda is poised now.
Absolutely. And compared to like next year, it'll be 40 years ago that I met it. And, and just in that time,
right.
It's grown so much in the last 40 years and so many more, when I first was in it, people would say, Ayur what,
Yeah. Absolutely. You have the perspective of time. So awesome. Well, this was wonderful for me, Amadea. I really enjoyed chatting with you. I love the recipes and what you did with them and sharing your other work and your response to the questions. So thank you so much. Where can people find you?
Yeah, AmadeaMorningstar.net.
Okay.
My next workshop will be May 18th and 25th. So coming right up.
And that's going to be on the Ayurvedic recipes and playing with the recipes.
Exactly. Yeah. If people go to the Institute and click on classes, they'll find it.
Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, it's been such a pleasure to meet with you, Noreen. It's just really, I feel like we're old friends.
Yeah, we have some mutual friends. So I really appreciate that.